Thank you. Thanks, Anna and Rachel, for great presentations. And thanks to the Student Organized Committee and all of you for starting my voice a little worse, for coming out today. Firstly, I'm a student at the City University of New York in the MPH, Masters in Public Health program, and kind of came to SD through studying with Nassim Sponchi, who Rachel had also worked with. And originally, I worked in communications for quite a while, done public health communications and other violence prevention campaigns, and specifically around firearm violence. So hence our topic today, which is really focusing on capturing the dynamics of firearm ownership in New York State. And briefly, I'll acknowledge the team that's kind of been helping me along with this project. Nassim, who I mentioned, David Lounsbury, Rachel, who presented earlier, and Matthew, all of you contributed in some way, and it was very helpful, and I could have done this without you. The background, initially looking at this problem, as many of you know, it's a very complex problem, and especially in New York, which is not known for necessarily having the highest levels of firearm violence. Firearm violence was decreasing quite a bit over the period of 2010 through 2019. And so we saw this pretty large drop off. And then around 2020, as in many other states, a pretty steep increase. So this graph, which you can see at the bottom, shows the 10-year average from 2010 through 2019, and then comparison between 2020, 2021, and 2022, which are the 2022 data is preliminary, but it still shows this relatively 20% increase. So that previous 20% reduction is pretty much getting wiped off the map. And that's kind of the worry here, is how can we fix that? Or how can we at least describe that problem? And that primary goal, so this goal, as I discussed, we really in this project, I'm just trying to understand the feedback structures behind this complex problem, of owners and incidents of firearm violence in the state. And then our secondary goal, which is still not it's still in development, but really testing different scenarios, looking at potential policies, different ways of approaching the problem, and looking at prevention of the actual incidents of violence. In this way, we developed this reference mode, and this was originally a project that I developed with Nassim for a class, Nassim and David, I should say. And we kind of have this typical reference mode, which probably seems very basic. I mean, it's really just the initial conceptualization of how I thought the modeling would go, and kind of introduces the idea of looking at firearm violence in terms of an average over 6 months, which I'll talk about more later. And it's informed by this reference mode. It's informed by historical data from both the U.S. Department, scroll down, U.S. Department of Justice, FBI crime statistics, and the New York Department of Criminal Justice Services, who that's kind of the main data sources for a lot of the data points around ownership and incidents of firearm violence. So I developed a model that kind of had this SIR structure, looking at who is susceptible. In this case, it was basically the whole state, and focusing on several violence prevention policies, including violence interruption programs and extreme risk protection orders, which are a type of order that was passed as a policy in New York as a solution to kind of curb gun violence at a very downstream level, where people had already exhibited signs of violent behavior. So that was kind of our initial, that was my initial frame. So it really relied on this exogenous data sources, not a ton of dynamic relationships. And although the outputs did match, the historic data, it didn't really allow for a lot of testing. It was really kind of data bounded. I was influenced by a model developed by Sorone, and I'll butcher the name if I try to pronounce it all the way, but it was a system dynamics model of violent trauma and the role of violence prevention, violence intervention programs in the Journal of Surgical Research, which was published in 2020. I'll have references later. And that was kind of influential in looking at high risk and low risk behavior as part of the model. So you can see, I'll just briefly show you a snapshot. We won't go into the actual loops and all that because it's a bit complex. And this one, it was really kind of biting off more than I could chew when I made this one, because it has a bunch of exogenous data, exogenous inputs, and kind of looking at certain leverage points, such as like the risk of violence and different risks associated with suicide versus homicide. So as we revised the model, we incorporated certain risk factors, and I tried to look at things that were actually in the literature, what evidence was out there around what were preventive factors or protective factors, and kind of even more so became reliant on exogenous data. So as kind of a learning experience, this one was almost like a thought project more than anything else, because it was more limited. It didn't really have a ton of feedback structures, and in the end, this version of the model did not get even fully developed. So we kind of abandoned this path. And even though it was kind of interesting to see what protective factors could be tested, which maybe in the future I will try to do, at the moment it was pretty limited just in terms of these stocks and the risk factors having an effect, and the protective factors having effect. But I didn't even go so far as to develop a full feedback structure because it just became a little bit unwieldy. That said, the progress here, I think, was more in the structure of the model, the stock and flow, and kind of looking at how people move back and forth from low risk to high risk, or even going back to no longer owning a firearm and what might influence them to do that. So that brings us to the third model iteration. In this case, the stocks are simplified, so all firearm violence events are grouped together, so homicide, suicide, and accidental shootings. And this is a slightly different structure. Now we're working with an SEIR structure, so there's the added element of the exposed. And this more incorporated actual feedback, fewer exogenous effects were included, and it allowed for testing of more complex scenarios, which is something that's kind of the secondary goal, the kind of part two, which is still in development. And then we have this kind of opportunity to do more policy testing now. Briefly, I'll just look at the SEIR structure, susceptible and exposed, infected, recovered structure that became kind of the basis for this third version of the model, where potential firearm owners are the susceptible group, and new firearm owners are the exposed, and they flow into low risk or high risk behavior. And then individuals may discontinue and go back to the kind of initial susceptible or recover. They're kind of recovered, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the third model structure, this is the zoomed out version. Of course, it's probably hard to read, but you can see that we have two reinforcing loops, the ones in red at the bottom, and then the awareness loop. And so now we kind of have this very simple stock and flow structure, but it has kind of defined boundaries, and it kind of assumes that gun supply is unlimited. So there's no real supply feature here. It's just if you choose to take on this behavior or not, such as owning a firearm, and then how you carry that firearm kind of determines your low and high risk status. So looking at the stocks more in detail, as I said, we have like this kind of modified SEIR structure where people move from potential ownership to new ownership to low risk or high risk. And then with the influence of the awareness loop, we start to see more people moving. This is, again, I'll try to grab a little laser pointer. Let me see if I can get this to work. So up here, they have the awareness folks, or the awareness effect, which is affecting both the individuals deciding to adopt high-risk behavior, kind of reducing that high-risk behavior, and also encouraging people to go from low-risk firearm ownership to no ownership, or to potential ownership, to discontinuing ownership. Moving on to reinforcing loops. These are really related to the number of firearm violence events. So as events go up, increasing the perceived benefit of high-risk firearm ownership and also firearm ownership in general. So, and I'll point these out real quick. You can see there's the rate of firearm adoption goes up due to events, and then kind of there's a bit of a delay involved here, where it eventually leads to increases in perceived benefit of firearm adoption. And the delay, the kind of reason we chose this 6 month, every stock kind of is controlled by how many events happen in the 6 month period before. It's kind of trying to model the idea of how long it would take somebody to make a decision about their firearm ownership. So we chose 6 months as kind of a reasonable estimate of if firearm violence is increasing in your community, how long it might take you to decide how to respond. So there's the full model structure with all 3 loops. And then we ran a base run, and this base run of the simulated data is in blue, the green is the historic data. And although it matched the initial historical data from up until 2020, you can see it pretty much goes into a steady state or has some oscillation, not really matching the historical trends. In response to this, we developed what I'm calling the COVID-19 adjustment. So simulating the effects of COVID-19 on ownership and risk factors. So now we see a much closer fit in terms of the simulated data, again in blue, and the historical data. And this is, I'll speak a bit more about this. The adjustment, I looked at some of the different ownership factors, increasing the fractional rate of adoption. The individuals practicing safe storage and firearm safety was decreased to 2%, and the perceived benefit of high-risk firearm behavior was increased 50%. So that increase was just temporary, just until January 2021, but still, just by changing those parameters, we were able to kind of more closely find a fit for the model. And these kind of reflect what we saw in data and literature. This was from a study published by Garen Wintemute. And this was a change observed in, I believe it's the FBI background check system. So this expected, you can see in purple, there's an expected trend, which generally continues with the historic trend from the previous 10 years, and then the observed trend, which was quite a bit. So just citing that as kind of the thinking, some of the thinking that informed these changes. And this is, again, simulated data, but we can see quite a bit of an increase in firearm ownership. So an increase of about 300,000 people in the last in the case of the simulated data, the last 6 years, but when comparing with historic data, really starting in 2020, we started to see this pretty massive increase. And as that increase occurred, it did not necessarily mean that firearm events occurred at the same increase. So this is kind of an interesting insight. I think it shows the effect of how low risk and high risk behavior can really affect the amount of events per capita. So this graph is showing how many events are occurring per 6 months per capita per firearm owner. So even as in the previous slide, firearm ownership is going up exponentially. That does not mean that the risk or the firearm events will go up at that same rate. So there is some potential there for testing policies of maybe encouraging safer firearm use or storage or low risk behavior, and how people maybe might carry firearms for different reasons. Some of the assumptions about low risk and high risk ownership, I feel like I should clarify. Just this is a very broad generalization. Currently, the low risk owners do not contribute to new firearm violence events. they're assumed to account for a very small fraction of the overall events. So just to have this kind of simplified model structure, it's only the high risk users that are owners that are contributing to the events. And hopefully in further model development, we can kind of clarify this and maybe show like how that dynamic maybe would change over time. And the high risk owners are the ones who are in general more likely to carry unloaded and unlocked firearms, including firearms that may be illegally obtained. So over time, you can see as prior to 2020, ownership of low risk ownership, which is depicted in green on this graph, green with the triangles, is going up kind of while high risk ownership is going down. However, around 2020, we see a spike in high risk ownership and then a kind of general trend of both types of ownership increasing. So the low risk owners are increasing and the high risk owners are now increasing at the same time. And this is a percent of the total population. So right now we're looking at, I think in my last calculations, about 16.5% of owners are, or 16.5% of the New York population are owners. And kind of moving along as quickly as I can, since I know I've taken some time, the comparative effect of the awareness loop on firearm events, kind of simulating how increases in awareness may cause decreases as seen in green. The blue line is the normal number of normal effective awareness, and the reduced effective awareness is the red line, which could cause, in this case, upwards of 1,000 more events per 6 months. Quickly, the limitations, we did model this in aggregate. So all of these events are in aggregate. We are not really taking into account a lot of recent policy decisions or a Supreme Court decision, which has affected firearm ownership in New York, kind of opening up more people to potentially be owners. And we don't really distinguish between different outcomes right now between suicides and accidental shootings and homicides. So finally, the next steps, incorporate these feedback structures around motivation to carry, specifically around handguns, refine the overall structure of the model, and develop smaller models for specific populations, such as specific communities or other states or rural communities in New York, and test the following policies, such as extreme risk protection orders, which I mentioned earlier, violence interruption programs, and community support programs. If you'd like a list of the literature, please let me know. Hopefully this can be made available through the conference website. And just want to thank you and thank everybody for coming.
We have time for 2 questions. Yes, Brad.
I have one. Thank you. Great work on a very important topic. So the core of this is an SIR structure or SEIR structure. SIR models have tipping points, which means that under certain situations, it's going to continue to grow, and under certain situations, it's not going to continue to grow. I would love to encourage you to explore finding that in this situation. I suspect, although I'm not sure, that we're well past the tipping point where there's continued growth, but I think it might inform the searching for policies that could bring them into a better regime moving forward. So do you have any sense of whether what I'm saying is on target now in terms of the tipping point in your model, and any insights about what the current situation is relative to where that is?
Yes, that's a great point, and really in that initial I didn't show you my causal loop diagram, but I kind of initially conceptualized in this model. I kind of thought that might be something that we could explore, like trying to find where the tipping point might be. I think that kind of unfortunately got pushed to the side while we tried to make a model that had dynamics and was testable. In terms of whether I think we're past the tipping point, it's hard to say, because I think that even though ownership is exponentially increasing, I don't know if using an SIR model to model firearm violence is a bit difficult, because you don't really know when someone's recovered, and so the tipping point could have been at 2020, and we maybe could test a different scenario where ownership, what would happen if ownership didn't increase exponentially? What would happen if like the more intense, like the Supreme Court decision wasn't passed and a more intense law came down to prevent certain people from, purchasing firearms at a potentially unlimited rate like we have now. So I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I think that's a really, that's thought provoking. That's very much where I'd like to go with this kind of next step of testing just model behavior over time, and how maybe introducing different factors, whether that be policies or new awareness loops, might affect that.
So I think we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. Thank you to everyone who came to our student speakers. They all did a fabulous job. I think we have a quick break before the next session, but Canty can tell you more about